be incredibly tough to bridge the gap between like dusty, old historical texts that conjure the image of an 87-year-old professor droning on at the blackboard about the Peloponnesian War, and the more modern historical fiction, basically, that seems to be dominating the history genre. But The Greatest Knight by Thomas Asbridge is an incredible entry in the middle ground, leaning more towards history, of course, but also being written in such a way that it doesn't make you want to tear your hair out from boredom. It's a history book that not only scholars and professors can get a lot out of because of how well sourced it is, because of how well written it is, but also the layperson, someone who just wants to dip their toes into medieval history, who wants to read a narrative, who wants to learn about this time period without having battle maps and this date on this date on this date and having to remember all the names. It is written in a way that allows someone to approach the topic without having a PhD in the topic beforehand. And the way Asbridge does this is through narrative. We have an issue in a lot of history books where it's just date after date after date, and there's not a narrative written in. A lot of history is ripe for a retelling, still well-sourced. I'm not talking about historical fiction here. A well-sourced, valid history retold with good writing and a good narrative structure that will bridge the gap between history and a novel, that will allow people to actually gain enjoyment from learning about the subject. And whenever I find a history book that does this, I have to talk about it because it is so rare. But when you find something like this, it is so entertaining, and I learned so much from this book. I found this book so entertaining and so fulfilling, and I learned so much that I want to try to entice you to give it a chance, even if medieval history isn't really your cup of tea. And yes, that was an English joke because it is about medieval England, and they really love tea in England. Let's get on to the review. So The Greatest Knight is about William Marshal, a name that maybe you've heard. If you're not very familiar with medieval history, you probably haven't heard it, but William Marshal is thought of and talked about as Lancelot, the real life Lancelot from the Arthurian legend, which, you know, is a lot to live up to, but I think that he does. Marshal was a central figure in 5 different kings' reigns during the medieval time period in which he lived. He was involved in the Magna Carta. He was a tournament champion knight. He was involved in countless wars, crusades. He did it all, and the way that Asbridge writes his life is so incredibly interesting that it feels like you are reading Game of Thrones. But I will say, if you are looking for a strict biography just on William Marshal, you may not get it from this text, because although William Marshal is our central character, he is not written in a biography style. We're not getting his day-to-day, he woke up, he ate this, like some of the biographies of the past, some of the massive volumes of biographies. If you want to read a crazy biography, look up one of Churchill's biographies that's like every single day for his entire time as prime minister. It's crazy. You're not going to get that with this book. And I think that's to its credit. That enhances it, because as interesting as William Marshal is, without the context of the events going on around him, you really wouldn't get a feel for how impactful this human being was in the course of history. So we follow Marshal, but we're not always with him. Sometimes there are moments where he's not even part of the central drama, of the central narrative, of the history that is taking place. He's off doing something else, and Asbridge takes some time to inform us about what a king is doing here, or what a princess is doing there, or how the Crusades are going. And that may not be what a lot of people are looking for, but for me, I really like that aspect of the book. We always had a grasp on where William Marshal was. It was always still about him, but we were able to understand the broader context of things and get more value out of it. It is really a well-written, tight narrative. It's not 800 pages. You can get through this book without having to, sign away your soul to read for the rest of, the year. It's a really fast read, but it is also so packed full of information. One of the other things that I really liked about this book was getting a taste of what it meant to be a knight in this time period, because this was a bit prior to the modern chivalric knights that we read about in the 14th and 15th centuries. This was a little bit earlier, taking place in the 12th century and 13th century. So it was just as knighthood and chivalry were becoming a thing, basically, that William Marshal was becoming a knight. And so it was so interesting to see the character, the person of William Marshal grow with the idea of knighthood, and in some ways shape the idea of knighthood because he was such an impactful figure. It is just so interesting, and if you have even the slightest amount of interest in knights in medieval history, please give this a try. I think you'll really like it. I've made reference to A Song of Ice and Fire before. It's so incredible that if William Marshal's life was written as a plot point in the next Song of Ice and Fire book, if that day ever comes that we get another Song of Ice and Fire book, you would not believe it. You would say, "Oh, George has lost it. He's being too grand. He's being too indulgent. This can't be real." Because there are moments in this human being's life that are like, you're like, this cannot be real. But what is another really, really powerful point in this book is that Asbridge, the author, is writing off of a primary source that was a biography that was commissioned by William Marshal's son. So he understands that as a chronicler that was working in the time period of William Marshal, so this was written in the 12th or 13th century, this history. So you have to understand that this would be written in more of a flattering light. I mean, it was commissioned by the man's son, for goodness sakes. Like, the chronicler is not going to write any negative in that case. But a good historian, a good writer, which Asbridge is, will take that primary source, will lean on that primary source, but will also use other sources around the time period, other chroniclers, to fill in the gap so that Marshal is not this impossible figure, but is actually a human with wants and desires and failings and trappings, and still was an incredible person, but we get more of a realistic picture because of the work that Asbridge does with this book. And I think that that is so powerful. He weaves it in so well. There are moments where basically he talks directly to the reader and says, this is how it was written in the history of William Marshal, which is the primary source he's working on. But let's remember, this is a needlessly flattering document, so we also have to look towards other sources. He brings the reader into that process, and I found that that was really impactful for me to always try and keep things straight and to actually get a realistic and accurate picture of what was going on. It's a real credit to Asbridge as a historian and as a writer in an era that is moving towards a little bit shakier historiography. There's a little bit more emphasis on secondary sources. There's a little bit more emphasis on the opinions of the historian, of the writer, which is the author's prerogative. I'm not going to take that away from anybody. But when I am going to a historical text, primarily I'm looking for what happened, when it happened, how it happened, and I want it to be sourced as close to the events as possible. So getting something like this, which was 12th century, written in French, commissioned for posterity's sake from Marshal's son, and also other chroniclers, it really lends validity to the fact that this book actually happened, that these things in this book actually took place, which is just so valuable in today's history landscape. There are a ton of popular history books that are shaky at best with their sourcing, and to find something like this that was written in the modern era is a breath of fresh air. So if you are interested even the slightest bit in knights in medieval history, like I've said before, please give The Greatest Knight by Thomas Asbridge a try and let me know what you think down in the comments. Thank you so much for watching a history nerd rant about a good history book. It's just so rare that I come across a history book that has almost everything for almost all people. It's an incredible narrative. It's very well sourced. It doesn't sacrifice any validity. It's just a really, really good history book. I think it's 4 out of 5 for me. Really enjoyed it. Let me know what you think. Thank you so much for watching. We put out videos about books all the time on this channel. So if you're looking to talk about books, please subscribe. Thank you for watching. See you in the next one.